the unforgiving sun of the Arizona Territory, bleached the very life from the land, leaving only dust and ghosts. It was a place where a man's reputation was his only shadow, and for Grayson Hayes, that shadow was long and dark. They said he had a spirit as hard as the granite hills and eyes that had seen too much killing. He rode alone, trusted no one, and sought nothing but solitude. But solitude is a fragile thing. On a day choked with heat and silence, he found her, a woman with no name, no memory, and a past someone had tried to bury in a shallow, unmarked grave. This isn't a story about a damsel in distress. This is the story of how a feared man, in saving a forgotten woman, was forced to confront the one thing he feared more than any bullet, his own heart. The town of Redemption Gulch was aptly named. It was a place people came to escape a past or to die trying. It clung to the side of a dusty canyon, a collection of weathered wood and broken dreams, lorded over by the twin authorities of Sheriff Eli Vance's law and the unspoken law of the gun. And in Redemption Gulch, no gun was more respected or more feared than the one holstered on the hip of Grayson Hayes. Grayson wasn't a lawman or an outlaw. He was something far more dangerous, a man who wanted to be left alone. He owned a small defensible ranch, nestled in the crags a few miles from town, a place he'd bought with money no one dared ask the origins of. He was tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. When he walked into the general store, conversations would wither. When he entered Maeve O'Connell's saloon for a rare whiskey, the boisterous piano would soften to a nervous melody. People didn't whisper about him. They fell silent. They knew the stories of a gunslinger, once called the Shadow of the Cimarron, of lightning-fast draws in towns, whose names were now synonymous with bloodshed. He had come to Redemption Gulch to bury that man, but the ghost still lingered. His days were a ritual of hard labor and silence, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, and staring out at the vast, indifferent expanse. It was on one such day, while tracking a stray calf near the sun-scorched flats they called the Devil's Anvil, that his horse, Boudica, shied violently. Grayson's hand went to his colt by instinct, his eyes scanning the shimmering heat. It wasn't a rattlesnake. It was a splash of color against the drab ochre of the earth, the pale blue of a tattered dress. He dismounted his boots, sinking into the hot sand. Lying half buried by the wind was a woman. Her hair, the color of spun gold, was matted with dirt and blood. One side of her face was a canvas of deep, ugly bruises, her lip split. Her dress was fine silk, now ripped and ruined, a stark contrast to the brutal landscape. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been thrown from a great height and shattered. Buzzards were already circling high above, patient and certain. Grayson's first instinct was the one that had kept him alive for 35 years: turn around and ride away. Trouble had a way of finding him, and this woman was a storm of trouble just waiting to break. She was likely from a passing stagecoach, robbed and left for dead. Or worse, she was running from someone who would come looking for her. Bringing her into his life was an invitation for the world he'd tried so hard to escape to come crashing back down. He stood over her for a long moment, the silence broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. He could see the faint, almost imperceptible flutter of her chest. She was alive. Barely. He saw the delicate line of her jaw, the fine bones of her hands, one of which was curled loosely in the sand. There was a vulnerability there that reached past the calloused shell he had built around himself. He had seen countless dead men, their faces frozen in shock or anger. He had put some of them in the ground himself. But this felt different. This felt like a sacrilege, with a curse that was more a prayer for his own foolishness. He knelt. He gently brushed the sand from her face, his touch surprisingly deft for a man whose hands were more accustomed to the cold steel of a gun than the warmth of another person's skin. Her eyelids flickered. They opened just a sliver, revealing eyes the color of a summer sky. But they were clouded with confusion and pain, seeing nothing. A soft, broken sound escaped her lips, a whimper that was swallowed by the wind. He looked up at the endless, empty horizon. He could leave her. The desert would claim her, and his peace would remain undisturbed. No one would ever know. But he would. That single, undeniable fact was a heavier weight than any posse or bounty. He, Grayson Hayes, the man who had walked away from a dozen gunfights without a scratch, could not walk away from this. Carefully he gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. As he lifted her, a small, leather-bound book, tucked into the tatters of her dress, fell to the ground. He picked it up. It was a diary, its pages filled with elegant looping script. But the cover was blank. No name. Nothing. Just like the woman in his arms. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. As he urged Boudica towards his ranch, towards the sanctuary he had built against the world, he knew he wasn't just carrying a dying woman. He was carrying a reckoning, and his hard-won peace was already turning to dust behind him. The first few days were a blur of fever and murmured nonsense. Grayson, a man more skilled in setting broken bones on cattle than tending to a human, found himself in uncharted territory. He cleaned her wounds with whiskey, and a grimace fetched Doc Elias Thorne from town under the cover of darkness and endured the old man's probing questions with terse, clipped answers. "Found her out on the flats near dead," Grayson had grunted. "Found her, or she was left for you," Doc Thorne asked, his eyes sharp over his spectacles as he examined the woman's bruised face. "These aren't the marks of a simple robbery, Grayson. This was personal. Vicious." Grayson offered no reply, his face a stone mask. He paid the doctor handsomely for his services, and his silence, an arrangement Thorne was wise enough to accept without further comment. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness. In her fevered state, she spoke in fragments, whispers of galloping hooves, velvet curtains, and a name, Silas, spoken not with affection, but with a chilling guttural fear. But when she was lucid, her eyes were vacant. The slate had been wiped clean. She knew not her name, nor where she came from, nor the face of the man who had nearly beaten the life out of her. The trauma had locked her past away in a vault to which she had no key. Grayson found it unnerving. He was a man defined by his past, a history written in scars and wanted posters he'd long since outrun. To look at her was to look at a blank page. He was gruff and impatient with her, at first leaving bowls of broth by her bedside with a muttered command to eat. But her helplessness began to chip away at his defenses. He found himself watching her sleep, noting the way a stray lock of golden hair fell across her cheek. He would adjust her blanket, his rough hands moving with an unpracticed gentleness. On the 5th day, her fever broke. She was awake, propped up on pillows, her sky-blue eyes clear for the first time. She watched him as he moved about the small Spartan cabin. Who are you?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "Grayson Hayes," he said, not turning from the stove where he was making coffee. "This is my ranch. And who am I?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Grayson finally turned to face her. "I don't know. You had no papers." "Nothing." He decided against mentioning the diary for now. It felt too private, a violation of a life she couldn't even remember. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and slow. "I have nothing." Something in his chest, a thing he thought long dead, clenched. "You have a place to stay," he heard himself say. "For now. Until you're strong." He needed a name for her. Calling her woman felt disrespectful. He thought of the stars he watched on his lonely nights, the only constants in his shifting world. There was one constellation, distant and beautiful. Luna. He said the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "I'll call you Luna, if that's all right by you." She looked at him, a flicker of something gratitude perhaps in her gaze. She nodded. "Luna," she repeated softly, as if trying on a new skin. The news of a woman at the Hayes Ranch spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire. Grayson had to go to town for supplies, and his presence caused a stir greater than usual. "Heard you found yourself some company, Grayson," Maeve O'Connell said, from behind the bar of her saloon, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. Maeve was a pillar of the town, a woman who knew everyone's secrets, and kept most of them. "Found some trouble is more like it," grumbled a cattleman named Peterson. "A man don't just find a half-dead woman in the desert. She was running from something, and whatever it is, it'll likely follow." Grayson ignored them, his silence, a more potent deterrent than any threat, but he felt their eyes on his back, their whispers following him down the dusty street. He was no longer just the feared recluse. He was a man with a mystery, and that made him interesting. It made him a target. Back at the ranch, Luna slowly regained her strength. She was quiet and tentative, moving around the cabin like a ghost. But life began to return to her. She started to help with small chores, her hands, though soft, proving capable. She would mend his shirts with stitching so fine it was nearly invisible. She learned to cook on his cast-iron stove, turning his bland rations of beans and bacon into savory meals. A strange, unspoken rhythm developed between them. They rarely spoke of her past or his. Instead, they existed in the present. He would come in from a long day's work to the smell of fresh bread and the sight of her sitting by the fire, her golden hair catching the light. He would watch her as she read the few books he owned, her brow furrowed in concentration. He found himself talking to her, telling her about his horse, about the way to read the clouds for rain. Small, simple things he hadn't shared with anyone in years. She in turn began to see past the fearsome reputation. She saw the way he was gentle with his horse. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes at the end of the day. She saw the loneliness he tried so hard to hide. One evening, he came in with a deep gash on his arm from a barbed wire fence. Without a word, she took a clean cloth and began to tend to it, her touch steady and sure. Their eyes met over the wound, and in that moment, the space between the feared gunslinger and the nameless woman vanished. There was only Grayson and Luna. He felt a powerful, terrifying urge to pull her close. He resisted, clenching his fists. This was a mistake. A fragile, beautiful thing had wandered into his harsh world, and he knew that men like him didn't get to keep beautiful things. They only broke them. "You should leave," he said abruptly, his voice rough. "Soon as you're able. Get to the next town. Start a new life." Luna looked at him, her blue eyes searching his. She wasn't afraid of his tone. She was beginning to understand that his harshness was a shield. "And where would I go, Grayson?" she asked softly. "I have no husband, no name, and no place to go. You are the only thing in this world I know." Her words were a simple truth, but they struck him with the force of a bullet. He had taken her in to save her life, but in doing so he had tethered her to his. And a life tethered to Grayson Hayes was a life lived in the shadow of the gallows. Weeks turned into a month. A fragile peace settled over the small ranch, a peace Grayson knew was borrowed time. Luna bloomed in the quiet safety of his home. Color returned to her cheeks, and the haunted look in her eyes was often replaced by a genuine smile, a sight that did strange things to Grayson's guarded heart. She had a laugh like wind chimes, and he found himself deliberately saying things he thought might coax it out of her. Their shared solitude forged a bond that was both intimate and unspoken. They moved around each other with a familiar grace, a silent understanding passing between them. One evening she pointed to a scar on his forearm. "How did you get this one?" she asked, her voice free of the fear most people showed him. He hesitated. "Card game in Laredo. The other man thought I was cheating." "Were you?" A rare ghost of a smile touched his lips. He was. It was the first time he had willingly offered a piece of his past. Emboldened, she began to ask more, not about the gunfights or the killing, but about him. About the farm in Ohio he'd left as a boy, about the first horse he'd ever broken. He found himself answering the words rusty from disuse. In her he found not a judge, but a confidant, a witness to the man he was not just the killer he had been. The change in him was not lost on the town. When he rode in for supplies, Maeve O'Connell noted the tension had eased from his shoulders. "That woman is either a saint or a sorceress," she commented to Sheriff Vance. "Let's hope she's a saint," Vance replied, polishing his badge. "Because a sorceress would bring the kind of attention Redemption Gulch can't afford." His words proved prophetic. The attention arrived on a tired bay horse in the form of a man named Franklin Pierce. Pierce was not a cowboy. He was dressed in a city suit, now rumpled and coated in dust. He had a tidy mustache, a bowler hat, and eyes that were cold and methodical. He was a Pinkerton agent, and his kind only came to town when money or power was involved. Pierce started his inquiries at the saloon. He laid a crisp photograph on Maeve's bar. It was a formal portrait of a woman with golden hair and hauntingly familiar blue eyes. It was Luna, dressed in opulent silks, a string of pearls around her neck, but her expression was one of profound, caged sadness. "Seen this woman?" Pierce asked, his voice polite but firm. "Name's Isabel Croft, wife of Mr. Silas Croft of the Croft Timber and Rail Company. Disappeared from their estate near Santa Fe about 2 months back. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her return." Maeve's face was a mask of practiced neutrality. "Can't say I have. Lots of folks pass through." Pierce's gaze swept the room, lingering on the faces of the locals who suddenly found their drinks fascinating. He knew he was being stonewalled. He spent the day asking questions, his presence casting a pall over the town. Sheriff Vance watched him, his hand never far from his pistol. Vance was a practical man. He didn't like Pinkertons any more than he liked outlaws. They were two sides of the same disruptive coin. The news reached Grayson's ranch before Pierce did, carried by a young boy from a neighboring homestead. "Man in a suit, Grayson. Asking about a woman. Got a picture of her." Grayson's blood ran cold. He looked at Luna, who was humming softly as she tended to her small vegetable garden, a picture of serene domesticity. The name the boy mentioned, Croft, meant nothing to him, but the description was undeniable. The past she couldn't remember was coming for her. That evening the knock came at the door. Grayson opened it to find Franklin Pierce standing on his porch, his hand resting on a holstered city revolver. "Mr. Hayes." Pierce began, his eyes flicking past Grayson to where Luna stood, frozen by the fireplace. His professional demeanor cracked for a moment, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "I believe you have something that belongs to my employer." Grayson didn't move. He filled the doorway, a human wall of silent menace. "You've got the wrong ranch." "I don't think so," Pierce said, regaining his composure. He held up the photograph. Mrs. Isabel Croft, her husband, Mr. Silas Croft, is a very powerful man. He's been worried sick. He'll be most grateful for her safe return. Luna stared at the picture. Her face paled, and she swayed on her feet. A look of sheer terror, primal and deep, crossed her features. She didn't recognize the woman in the photo, but her body did. A tremor ran through her. The name Silas, the one she'd whispered in her fever, had a face now, an unseen one, but it was enough to trigger a visceral reaction of pure dread. "She's not going anywhere," Grayson said, his voice a low growl. "That's not your decision to make." Pierce countered, his hand tightening on his gun. "She's his wife. That's the law." "There's law," Grayson said, his stormy eyes locking onto the Pinkertons. "And then there's what's right, and you ain't taking her." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The air crackled with a lethal intensity. The ghost of the Shadow of the Cimarron was standing on that porch, and Franklin Pierce, for all his city bravado, recognized it. He was a detective, not a gunfighter. He knew a suicidal draw when he saw one. "Mr. Croft will not be pleased to hear this," Pierce said, taking a slow step back. "He has extensive resources. You're making a powerful enemy, Hayes." "He won't be the first," Grayson replied, and slowly, deliberately closed the door in the man's face. He turned back to Luna. She was trembling, her arms wrapped around herself. "Isabel." She whispered the name, tasting like ash in her mouth. "He said my name is Isabel." Grayson crossed the room in 2 strides and took her by the shoulders. "It's just a name. It doesn't mean anything." "But he's coming," she said, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't explain. "The man, Silas, he's coming for me." "Let him come," Grayson said, his voice fierce with a protectiveness that surprised them both. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She buried her face in his shirt, her body shaking with sobs born of a fear she didn't understand. He held her, stroking her hair, murmuring words of comfort. The barrier between them, the last wall of his resistance, crumbled. This was no longer about charity or pity. This woman, this fragile soul the world had tried to erase, had become a part of him. He lifted her chin, and in the flickering firelight, he saw not just fear in her eyes, but trust. An absolute, unconditional trust that he would stand between her and the shadows. And in that moment, he knew he would. He would face down hell itself for her. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of promise. A raw, desperate sealing of a pact against the coming storm. It was a kiss that tasted of dust coffee and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a future. When they broke apart, they were no longer 2 lonely souls under one roof. They were a fortress of 2 waiting for the war that was now inevitable. The Pinkertons' visit left a permanent scar on the fragile peace of the ranch. The name Silas Croft was a spectre that haunted their quiet moments. Luna, or Isabel, as she now feared was her name, was plagued by nightmares. They were flashes of sensation rather than clear images, the suffocating scent of cigar smoke, the cold hardness of a signet ring against her skin, the sharp, terrifying sound of a man's raised voice echoing in a grand, empty hall. Grayson saw the terror that lived just beneath her surface. He became her shadow, rarely leaving her side. The work on the ranch fell behind as he prioritized her safety, his rifle always within arm's reach. The unspoken question of her past was now a living, breathing thing between them. He still had the small, leather-bound diary he'd found on her. He had resisted reading it, feeling it was a violation. But now, with danger on the horizon, ignorance was a luxury they could no longer afford. One evening he placed it on the table between them. "I found this with you," he said quietly. Maybe it's time." She stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was hers. She knew it instinctively, but the words were written by a stranger. October 14th, 1884. Silas presented me with this journal today. He said a woman of my station should record her thoughts. I suspect he merely wishes to have a key to my mind, as he has a key to every other room in this house. He smiled when he gave it to me, but his eyes were like chips of ice. I will write in it, but I will not write the truth. The truth is too dangerous to be kept even on paper. As she read, her hands began to shake violently. The entries were a chilling portrait of a life of gilded misery. They spoke of a husband, Silas Croft, a man of immense wealth and influence, who was obsessively controlling and privately cruel. He treated her not as a wife, but as his most prized possession, a beautiful object to be displayed and polished and punished if it showed any sign of a will of its own. November 3rd, 1884. He was angered tonight because I spoke with Senator Miller for too long at the reception. He did not raise his voice. He never does not in front of others. He waited until we were home. He backed me into the wall in the library and told me that my opinions were not required, only my presence. His thumb pressed into the hollow of my throat. "You are mine, Isabel," he whispered. "Do you understand that all of this?" He gestured around the opulent room. "Is nothing. You are my true fortune." It was not a declaration of love. It was a brand. Page after page detailed a life of psychological torment and escalating physical abuse, cleverly hidden behind a facade of wealth and respectability. The bruises were always somewhere that could be covered by a high-collared dress or long sleeves. Her isolation was absolute. The staff were his employees loyal to him. Her friends were chosen for her. Her letters were read before they were sent. Then came the final entries. January 12th, 1885. I found a way. A local horse trader, a kind man named Mr. Abernathy, has a sister in California. He sees the truth in my eyes. He has agreed to help me. I am selling the last of my mother's jewelry, the pieces Silas does not know about. It will be enough to start again. Somewhere. Anywhere. I feel a terror so profound it makes it hard to breathe, but it is eclipsed by a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, I feel something other than fear. I feel alive. January 19th, 1885. The final entry. He knows. God help me, he knows. I saw the look on his face when he came home tonight. He found Mr. Abernathy. I can hear him coming down the hall. The door is locked, but it will not hold him for long. This is not a home. It is a tomb. If I do not escape tonight, I will die here. My name is Isabel Croft, and I pray that someday someone will know I did not simply vanish. I tried to live. The diary slipped from Luna's nerveless fingers. The room tilted. The fractured nightmares, the whispers, the sensations, they all crashed together, forming a single horrifying picture. She wasn't Luna. She was Isabel Croft, and she hadn't escaped. He found me. She whispered, her eyes fixed on a distant point in the cabin, seeing a past that was now terrifyingly clear. The horse trader, Abernathy. Silas must have... Oh, God. She remembered the pounding on the door, the splintering wood. Grayson moved to her side, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Isabel," he said, using the name for the first time. It felt like a betrayal of the woman he'd come to know, but it was the truth. "He dragged me from the room," she said, her voice distant, her eyes seeing the memory unfold. He didn't yell, He was calm. That was always the most terrifying part. He took me to the stables. He told me he was going to teach me a lesson about property, about what happens when something of his tries to run away. The memories were flooding back, now a torrent of pain and terror. The ride out into the desert, the cold, methodical way he'd beaten her. The last thing she remembered was his face, silhouetted against the moon, looking down at her broken form on the ground. He said, "No one will ever find you. You will have no name. You will be nothing. You belong to me in this life and the next." She recited the words coming out in a choked, broken stream. He took my rings, my locket, everything. He left me for the coyotes. She collapsed into sobs, not the quiet tears of a confused woman, but the gut-wrenching, soul-shattering cries of a survivor reliving her own murder. Grayson pulled her into his arms, holding her, as she convulsed with the horror of her recovered life. He was no stranger to violence, but the calculated cruelty she described, the cold, possessive evil of this Silas Croft, filled him with a rage so pure and hot it nearly choked him. He held her for hours, rocking her gently as the dam of her memory broke, pouring out the poison of the last few years. He listened to it all, every humiliation, every threat, every moment of pain. He was her anchor in the storm of her own mind. When she finally fell into an exhausted, fretful sleep, in his arms, he carried her to the bed and gently laid her down. He looked at her face, no longer the serene visage of Luna, but the haunted, beautiful face of Isabel, a woman who had walked through hell and somehow impossibly survived. He picked up the diary and walked to the fireplace. He hesitated for a moment, then tossed it into the flames. He watched as the pages filled with so much pain and fear curled, blackened, and turned to ash. That life was over. The woman named Isabel Croft, the possession of a monster, was gone, burned away in the fire. He turned back to the sleeping woman. He would call her Luna. It was the name he had given her, the name of the woman who had mended his shirts, who had laughed at his dry jokes, who had looked at him without fear. That was the woman he had fallen in love with. That was the woman he would die for. He went to his gun belt, checking the action of his Colt, the smooth, familiar weight, a grim comfort in his hand. Franklin Pierce had said Croft had extensive resources. Grayson had only 6 bullets and a resolve forged in the fires of a bloody past. Let him come. He thought the rage now cooled into a deadly, unshakable purpose. Let the rich man come with his money and his hired guns. He was about to find out what it meant to try and take something from Grayson Hayes. Silas Croft did not come alone. He arrived like a plague at the head of a column of 12 men. They were not cowboys. They were hard-faced killers, hired guns from as far as the Texas Panhandle, their holsters tied down their eyes, cold and empty. Croft himself rode a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to the dusty trail-worn mounts of his men. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, looking utterly out of place and completely in command. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that held no warmth, only a chilling, proprietary arrogance. They rode into Redemption Gulch, not as visitors, but as an occupying army. The town fell silent. Shopkeepers vanished from their doorways. Mothers pulled their children inside. The 12 riders spread out their presence, an immediate and suffocating threat. Croft dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his polished boots sinking into the thick dust. Sheriff Eli Vance met him on the boardwalk, his hand resting on the butt of his shotgun. Vance was in his 50s, a man who preferred peace but had never backed down from a fight. "This is a peaceful town, mister," Vance said, his voice even. "State your business." "My business is with a thief," Croft announced, his voice carrying across the silent street. He didn't look at Vance, but at the town itself, as if addressing his subjects. "A man named Grayson Hayes. He has stolen my property. I've come to reclaim it." "If you're talking about the woman," Vance said, his knuckles white on the stock of his shotgun, "she's a human being, not property, and she's under my protection." A cold smile touched Croft's lips. "Your protection?" He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Sheriff, I own senators. I have governors who take my calls. Your tin star and your dusty little town are an irrelevance. I am here for my wife. Give her to me, and I will leave your pathetic hamlet in peace. Defy me." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the shuttered windows, "and I will unmake this place board by board." The threat was clear, brutal, and utterly sincere. This wasn't just about getting Isabel back. It was about punishing everyone who had dared to help her, about demonstrating the length of his reach and the totality of his power. News of the standoff traveled fast. Grayson and Isabel, watching from a ridge overlooking the town, saw it all. Isabel's breath hitched in her throat. Seeing Silas so confident and cruel brought the terror rushing back. "This is my fault," she whispered, her hands clenched. "The town, these people—" "This isn't your fault," Grayson said, his voice a low growl of contained fury. "This is his. Men like him think they own the world. It's time someone taught him otherwise." He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a grim resolve. "Stay here. Stay hidden. No matter what you hear." "Grayson, no. You can't face them alone." "I'm not asking for your permission, Luna," he said, using her name like a shield, a reminder of who she was to him. He kissed her hard, a desperate final gesture. "I'm telling you to live." He rode down into Redemption Gulch, not as a reclusive rancher, but as the man he had once been. The shadow of the Cimarron. He moved with an unnerving calm, his duster flowing behind him. He dismounted in the middle of the street, a lone figure facing down an army. "Croft!" Grayson's voice boomed sharp and clear. "Your fight is with me. Leave the town out of it." Silas Croft turned, a look of genuine amusement on his face. "Ah, the stable boy. The one who thinks he can own what is mine. I commend your courage, but it is deeply misplaced. You have no idea who I am." "I know exactly what you are," Grayson retorted, his hand hovering over the grip of his Colt. "A coward who beats women and hides behind hired guns." The amusement vanished from Croft's face, replaced by a flash of narcissistic rage. He was not used to being spoken to this way. "You will regret those words." He turned to one of his men, a scarred gunfighter named Rourke. "Kill him!" Rourke smiled, a predator given a command. He stepped into the street. "You heard the man, friend? This is where your story ends." But before Rourke could even clear his leather, Grayson's hand moved. It was a blur, a movement so fast it was barely perceptible. The roar of his Colt echoed off the canyon walls, and a perfect dark hole appeared in the center of Rourke's forehead. He collapsed into the dust without ever having fired a shot. A collective gasp went through Croft's men. They were killers, but this was something else. This was artistry. This was legend. Grayson's pistol was already leveled at the next man. "Who else wants to earn their pay?" he asked, his voice deathly quiet. From the sheriff's office, the unmistakable double cock of a shotgun broke the silence. Sheriff Vance stood in the doorway, his weapon leveled. "He's not alone." Suddenly another door opened. Maeve O'Connell appeared on the boardwalk of her saloon, holding an old, long-barreled rifle with surprising familiarity. "This town doesn't break so easy, Mr. Croft." One by one, others appeared. The blacksmith with his hammer, the general store owner with a pistol, Old Man Peterson with a buffalo rifle he hadn't fired in 20 years. They were terrified. They were outnumbered. But they were standing their ground. They had seen Grayson Hayes, the man they had feared, and kept at a distance ride-in to face an army for one of their own. And in that moment, he was no longer an outsider. He was their champion. Silas Croft looked around, his expression shifting from arrogance to disbelief, then to pure, unadulterated fury. This was not how it was supposed to go. These insignificant people were defying him. "You fools!" he screamed, his composure finally cracking. "You're all signing your own death warrants. Kill them all, and burn this town to the ground." The siege had begun. The street erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Grayson dove behind a water trough, the wood splintering around him as bullets tore through it. Sheriff Vance fired both barrels of his shotgun, clearing 2 of Croft's men off the boardwalk opposite. The battle for Redemption Gulch and for the soul of a woman named Isabel was being fought with blood and lead in the afternoon sun. High on the ridge, Isabel watched in horror, torn between Grayson's command to stay hidden and the desperate urge to do something, anything, to stop the carnage that had followed her from the shadows of her past into the heart of her newfound home. The street became a slaughterhouse. Dust and gun smoke mingled, creating a choking, acrid haze that blurred the lines between the living and the dead. Grayson moved with a deadly economy of motion he hadn't called upon in years. Every shot was precise, every movement calculated. He was a phantom in the chaos, appearing from behind a corner to drop a gunman, then vanishing again before the others could draw a bead on him. The shadow of the Cimarron was not just a name, it was a promise of swift, merciless death. Sheriff Vance, a bulwark of defiant law, laid down, suppressing fire from his office doorway, his shotgun roaring like a cannon. Maeve O'Connell, to everyone's astonishment, proved to be a crack shot, her rifle picking off one of Croft's men as he tried to flank the blacksmith's shop. The townspeople, while not seasoned fighters, fought with the desperate courage of those defending their homes. Their sporadic, often inaccurate fire was enough to add to the confusion, forcing Croft's men to seek cover, unable to focus their full attention on Grayson and the sheriff. Silas Croft, who had never fought a real battle in his life, had retreated to the relative safety of the town's livery stable, directing his men with enraged shouts. He saw his hired army being whittled down by a reclusive gunslinger and a handful of shopkeepers. It was an insult to his power, an affront to the natural order of his world. His rage became focused, primal, and directed at one person, Isabel. She was the cause of this. She had brought this humiliation upon him. High on the ridge, Isabel was trapped in a prison of her own indecision. Grayson's words, "I'm telling you to live," echoed in her mind. But what kind of life could she have if he died for her? If the whole town burned for her? The woman who had penned that last desperate diary entry was a victim. The woman who had named herself Luna and found love in the arms of a quiet, dangerous man was a survivor. She had to choose which one she would be. With a final tearful look towards the town, she made her choice. She wasn't a fighter, not with guns. But Silas's weakness wasn't a lack of firepower. It was his ego, his obsession. She was the one thing he wanted more than victory. She was the ultimate prize. She spurred her horse and rode not away from the fight, but towards it. Down in the street the tide was turning. Only 4 of Croft's men remained pinned down and losing their nerve. Grayson was reloading behind an overturned wagon when he saw her, Isabel riding hard down the main road, her golden hair flying behind her like a banner. "No!" Grayson roared, a raw sound of pure anguish. She ignored him, pulling her horse to a halt in the eerie quiet that had fallen As every combatant stared at her sudden appearance, she looked directly at the livery stable. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice ringing with a strength no one, least of all Silas, had ever heard from her. "It's me you want. Let them go. I'm here." A slow, triumphant smile spread across Silas Croft's face as he emerged from the stable. This was the ending he had envisioned, his property returning to him. He held up a hand, and his remaining men lowered their weapons. "Isabel, my love," he said, his voice dripping with condescending affection. "You've caused such a fuss. Come now, it's time to go home." He started walking towards her, his arms outstretched. "Stay where you are," Grayson yelled, stepping out from behind the wagon, his Colt leveled at Croft's chest. "Put the gun down, stable boy," Croft sneered, not even glancing at him. "This is between a husband and his wife, a private matter." He kept his eyes locked on Isabel. "You see, my dear, these people can't protect you. No one can. You belong to me." "No," Isabel said, her voice shaking but firm. She dismounted, standing her ground. "I am not a possession, Silas. I am not a thing you can own or break. You beat me. You left me to die in the desert. You took my name, but you didn't kill me." A flicker of annoyance crossed Croft's face. This was not the broken, compliant creature he remembered. "You're confused, my dear. Hysterical. That man has poisoned your mind." "No," she repeated, taking a step towards him. "He showed me what it is to be treated like a person. He gave me a safe place. He gave me a new name. A name I chose." She looked past Silas, her eyes finding Grayson's across the dusty street. "My name is Luna." That was the breaking point, the ultimate act of defiance. She had not only survived, she had replaced him. Croft's mask of civility shattered, revealing the monster beneath. He lunged for her, his hand reaching out like a claw. "You are Isabel!" he roared. But Grayson was already moving. He fired not at Croft, but at the ground just in front of his feet, the bullet kicking up a spray of dirt that made Silas flinch back. In that single moment of distraction, the reckoning came from an unexpected quarter. Sheriff Vance, who had been quietly circling around the livery stable, emerged from the shadows behind Silas Croft. He didn't fire a shot. He swung the heavy stock of his shotgun like a club, connecting solidly with the back of Croft's head. Silas crumpled to the ground, unconscious, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with a dull, ignominious thud. His remaining men, seeing their employer defeated and their numbers decimated, threw down their guns in surrender. A profound silence fell over Redemption, Gulch broken only by the groans of the wounded and the sobbing relief of the townspeople. Grayson holstered his pistol and strode across the street, his eyes never leaving Luna's. He stopped in front of her, his face a mixture of fury, relief, and overwhelming love. "That was the bravest, most foolish thing I have ever seen," he said, his voice hoarse. "You told me to live," she replied, a tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "I couldn't do that by hiding." He reached out his hand, gently cupping her face, his thumb wiping the tear away. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, reassuring himself that she was real, that she was safe. The town watched as the feared gunslinger held the nameless woman two broken pieces, who had somehow, against all odds, made each other whole. They had faced their pasts, and in the blood and dust of that street, they had finally earned their future. In the aftermath, Redemption Gulch was a town wounded, but not broken. The street was littered with the debris of the battle, and the air still hung heavy with the smell of spent gunpowder. But beneath the surface of the quiet cleanup, a new spirit was taking hold. The shared ordeal had forged a bond of iron between the townspeople. They had faced down a tyrant, and won. Sheriff Vance, ever the pragmatist, had Silas Croft and his surviving men locked securely in the town's cells. "A man with his kind of money and connections won't stay locked up forever," Vance told Grayson as they watched Doc Thorne tend to the wounded. "But we'll send for the territorial marshal. With testimony from half the town, they'll have to hold him for a good long while, long enough for him to become yesterday's news." The real change, however, was in how the town saw Grayson Hayes. He was no longer the feared outsider. He was their protector. Old Man Peterson clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 2 days prior. Maeve O'Connell poured him a whiskey on the house, her eyes filled with a newfound respect. They didn't pry or ask about his past. They didn't need to. They had seen the man he was today, and that was enough. But Grayson's focus was singular. He and Luna returned to his ranch, the small cabin that had once been his fortress of solitude, now feeling for the first time like a home. The silence that returned was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the comfortable, peaceful silence of two people who needed no words. They stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. "Isabel Croft is dead," she said softly, not with sadness but with a final, quiet finality. "She died in the desert. You found Luna?" "I did." Grayson agreed, his voice rough with emotion. He turned to her, taking her hands in his. His hands were calloused and scarred, but his touch was gentle. "Luna Hayes. How does that sound?" Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "It sounds like a place to go, like a name, like a husband." He pulled her close, and they stood there for a long time, watching the first stars begin to appear in the twilight sky. The ghosts of their pasts were finally quiet. The shadow of the Cimarron and the wife of Silas Croft were gone, replaced by a rancher, and his wife, two people who had found in each other not just love, but redemption. He had been a man with a name he wanted to forget, and she had been a woman who couldn't remember hers. He was feared for the violence in his past, and she was haunted by the violence in hers. He had offered her a roof, and she had given him a home. She had no husband, no name, and no place to go. Now, standing under a blanket of stars in the vast, quiet territory, she had all three. And the feared man who had taken her in was no longer feared, not by her, not by the town, and perhaps, finally, not by himself. He was simply loved. Together they turned from the last light of the fading day and walked into their new life, hand in hand. And so, in the heart of the wild and unforgiving West, a story that began with violence and despair found its end in peace and hope. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in gold mines or train robberies, but in the quiet courage of a human heart. Grayson and Luna's journey shows us that our pasts do not have to be our prisons, that a new name, a new life, and a new love can be forged in the most unlikely of places. It proves that even the most feared man can have a gentle soul, and the most broken woman can rise again with unbreakable strength. Theirs is a testament to the enduring power of love, to heal, to redeem, and to build a home where there was once only wilderness. If this story of love loss and redemption in the Old West moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who loves a timeless tale of courage. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story from the dusty trails of history. What was your favorite moment in Grayson and Luna's journey? Let us know in the comments below.